Merry Christmas, 1983. Now, while most people were exchanging the standard gifts of ties and socks and fruitcakes and ugly sweaters, Neil Young received a very special gift from his record label, Geffen Records. It was a lawsuit for $3.3 million. The lawsuit alleged that the last three albums that Neil Young had recorded were uncharacteristic or unrepresentative of Neil Young. In other words, Geffen Records was suing Neil Young for not sounding like Neil Young. Now, at the time, Geffen Records was a fairly new record label, and they were super stoked when they signed the legend Neil Young. They were looking for the next Heart of Gold. They wanted the denim, they wanted the guitars, and instead they got this, Trans. And honestly, if you listen to this album, you might side with Geffen a little bit. It doesn't sound like Neil Young. This 1982 album, instead of having those guitars and that denim, had synthesizers and vocoders. It didn't sound like Young. It didn't sound like anybody. It didn't really even sound human. But that was the point. Today we're going to look back at this strange moment in music history, and specifically we want to look at the instrument or the tool that Young used, the vocoder. So okay, it is technology history time, because before Neil Young used a vocoder to confuse David Geffen, the vocoder was used to confuse the Nazis. So it's the 1940s and the world is at war, and Churchill is in England and FDR is in America, and they need to communicate with one another, and they're using radio waves to do it. There's a problem. The Nazis actually have a radio station in Norway that is intercepting all radio communication and deciphering it. So they're listening in and they're hearing everything that the leaders of the Allied nations are saying to one another. Well, in steps Bell Telephone Laboratories with a solution called SIGSALY. Look at this thing. This is not a plug-in on your laptop. This thing was massive. It took over 30 racks of equipment. It weighed over 50 tons, and it took up more than one room, and the rooms had to have their own air conditioning to keep the vacuum tubes from melting. And at its heart was a device that had been invented by Homer Dudley at Bell Labs, a device that he called the voice encoder, or the vocoder. And what the vocoder basically did was it breaks down the human voice into its constituent frequencies and compresses the data so that you can pass the entire human voice and its frequencies across phone lines. And in this case with SIGSALY, it allowed the human voice to not be just turned into data, but to be encrypted. And did it work? It worked. SIGSALY was not broken by the Nazis. Communications were secure between FDR and Churchill thanks in large part to the vocoder. So it was perfect for warfare, but could it be used to make music? Well, it's interesting because earlier in the 1930s, Bell Labs had actually used the vocoder to record an old Irish folk song, and it gave it this crazy ethereal quality. But no one really did anything with it, and no one really thought to use a vocoder in music until the mid-1960s. It was then that a young artist and tech aficionado named Wendy Carlos discovered the vocoder. Now, Carlos was already using technology to experiment with music. Carlos was partnering up with Bob Moog, who had built the Moog synthesizer. And Carlos had recorded Bach music using a synth and put the album out as Switched on Bach, which ended up becoming the most successful classical music album to date. It went to #1 on the Billboard classical charts for 49 weeks and it hit platinum. So Carlos knew what was going on when it came to using technology in music and had read about the vocoder in tech journals when at the New York's Fair in 1964, Carlos stumbled upon Bell Laboratories' exhibit, and they happened to have a vocoder. Carlos began recording vocal music using the vocoder, and the results were unanimous. People hated it. They didn't like the sounds that it was creating, but Carlos continued working on it and actually recorded part of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the choral arrangement, with a vocoder, put it on a tape, and got it into the hands of Stanley Kubrick. Now, Kubrick was coming off the success of 2001: A Space Odyssey and had just filmed A Clockwork Orange, which would go on to be a cult classic, but was looking for music for the film when he heard this tape and decided that this was exactly what he was looking for. And so he put Carlos's arrangement using the vocoder into the movie, and the vocoder moved, transformed from being just a sort of tech tool to actually becoming a musical instrument. The dam broke open. Kraftwerk began using it in their songs and their albums. ELO began to use it. Herbie Hancock used it. Stevie Wonder used it. Africa Bambaataa used it. It felt like everyone was starting to use the vocoder in music. You were hearing it all over the place. You even hear it if you go back and watch the 1978 Battlestar Galactica, the voice of the Cylons. That's a vocoder. It became so normal, so accepted, that by 1998, when Cher released Believe, and people heard that robo-glide and wondered, how in the world did they do that? Well, Brian Taylor, one of the producers, said, oh, we just used a vocoder. Right? The vocoder was such an accepted instrument in music that he felt like that was an okay explanation, instead of actually revealing that it had been auto-tuned. And that brings us back to 1982, when Neil Young released his album, Trans. And not only was Geffen disappointed in it, critics were disappointed in it. Critics did not like it. Rolling Stone said that it was like seeing a satellite dish on a log cabin. It felt alien. It felt like it didn't belong. It felt inhuman. It was hard to understand. And yet, that was the point. At this time in Neil's life, his son Ben had been born with cerebral palsy and was struggling to communicate with the world around him. Neil said the reason that he used the vocoder in Trans is because he wanted to say something that you can't understand, because he felt like that was the frustration that he was seeing in his son's life. Think about that. For Neil Young, the vocoder wasn't a cool effect to try and sell records. It was a way, a means for a father to inhabit the world of his child. Young was inviting listeners, he was inviting us into that difficult, painful, distant space between a father and his son who can't speak. And that brings us to a concept by the technology philosopher Albert Borgman. Borgman defined this distinction between a device and a focal thing. Let's take heat or warmth as an example to tease out the distinction between the two. A device is a means to an end. It gives you a result or a solution, but it hides the work required to make it possible. So in our homes, we have a heating system where all you have to do is turn a dial or push a button and you get heat. It makes your life easier, but it hides the work, it hides what's required to make it possible. A hearth or a fireplace is the opposite. It's a focal thing. See, a fireplace requires that you put in the work. You have to go chop down wood. You have to bring the wood into your home. You have to build the fire. You have to start the fire. You have to tend the fire. And then the fire becomes a place that you gather around. It becomes almost a means to community. And so in the work that you're putting in the connections that it creates as a focal thing, it's creating greater meaning and connection in your life. We usually treat technology as a device. It makes our lives easier. AI can write that email for you, or GPS can get you to the destination without having to look at a map. But you see, Neil Young did the opposite. On Trans, he didn't use the vocoder to hide his effort. He used the vocoder to struggle. He used technology to center his art around his son's condition and their relationship. He didn't use the device to make singing simpler. He used it to make communication more meaningful. He turned a device into a focal thing. Well, Geffen Records eventually dropped the lawsuit and apologized to Neil Young. And Young actually went on to record 3 more albums with Geffen Records and continued basically just being a legend. But Trans left us with an enduring lesson. Technology is usually just a device that makes our lives easier. But in the right hands or in the right heart, it can be a means to deeper human connection. The difference isn't in the machine, it's in what we're doing with it. So if you like digging into stories like this about the collision of history and culture and technology, then I'd invite you to subscribe and let's continue on the journey together. I'm John Harden, and thanks for watching.